Introduction to wisdom literature. Okay, basic stuff. Wisdom literature includes Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Okay. Now, some people are going to say, well, some of the Psalms have wisdom literature vibes, and they would be right. So if you want to put some of the Psalms in there, that's fine. And some people say Song of Songs also has wisdom literature vibes, which is true. I would personally say Song of Songs has its own genre. I would say that's like Hebrew love poetry. Because to be frank, I probably wouldn't hand that to your average middle school boy and be like, here, try to be a discerning young man. Yeah, it's talking about like, well, I'm not gonna say it on YouTube. It's talking about some like, PG-13 stuff, and it's good, but it's not quite Proverbs, right? Not quite as universally applicable. So this is where most scholars would say like these three are square in the middle of the wisdom literature target. So we're going to talk about these three. Also, I think it's very important when we think literature, wisdom literature, to think of these three because these three wisdom literature books have a very unique relationship to one another. You really can't have one without the other, and that's really what I want to zoom in on tonight is the relationship between these wisdom literature books. So, let's talk about some of the shared features. So when you think wisdom literature, you want to think poetry, right? Proverbs, and then like some of the Psalms, again, fit that poetry, but also Job is a ton of poetry. It's narrative and poetry. But if you just open your Bible and look at Job, it's mostly poetry. And then Ecclesiastes, again, mostly poetry. And it is a sermon, but it's a very poetic sermon. So it's mostly poetry, mostly parallelism, right? Remember, poetry has that parallelism where it kind of says a similar thing two times. Also, themes in all three of these books fear of the Lord, similar theme. That's one thing that kind of makes them their own little team, their own little unit. They also all talk about like observations from nature and experience in a way that no other books do. It's very interesting. They pull a lot of their illustrations and a lot of their argumentation from nature itself. So that's very unique about wisdom literature. And so when you're thinking wisdom literature, of course it's divinely inspired. It's God's wisdom, but they're pulling from creation. They're pulling wisdom from God's creation in a really unique way. So that's very unique about wisdom literature. And then it's designed to shape character and discernment, right? So the goal of wisdom literature is like, I want you to be a person of character. I want you to be a wise person. I do not want you to be a foolish person. And that's not necessarily the primary goal of all the other books of the Bible in the way that it seems to be the primary goal of these three books. So those are the shared, that's kind of, if you're like, well, who's on that team? Like that, those are the qualifications to make the team. Now, so they are very similar, but they also have some different aims and some different natures. So Proverbs, short sayings with a focus on skillful living. Okay? Proverbs are like super pithy sayings. Technically, we have English proverbs. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? That would be an English proverb. Like it's this little short, easy to remember saying that we all kind of know. Now, of course, we know that's not a promise. Like if you actually ate an apple every day, like you may still need to go to the doctor eventually, right? So we know it's not a promise, but the principle, the implication of, hey, you eat healthy stuff, it's good for you. Like we understand the implication and it's easy and it's vivid and it's memorable. That's a proverb, right? Or like back home, we'd be like, don't stand on the dock and spit into the wind. Like that's a little proverb that we have back home. It's easy to remember, it's illustrative, it pulls from nature, it's heartwarming. So those are proverbs. Okay, Job next. So Job, which is very, very different from Proverbs, is wrestling honestly with undeserved suffering, right? So Proverb is a lot of those little pithy sayings. Job is primarily a narrative, right? It's a narrative about a righteous man who suffers. He has no idea why he's suffering, and he's wrestling with really with God and his loser friends the entire time. And we kind of get an answer at the end. And the answer is basically God saying, I'm God, period. So that's kind of what Job's got going on there. And then we have Ecclesiastes. So I'm curious, have any of you ever studied Ecclesiastes? No, 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 no. Oh, fascinating. Okay, y'all, Ecclesiastes is a weird book. It's a trippy one. Um, yeah, so Ecclesiastes is a brutally honest look at life under the sun. Okay, okay, well, since you guys have, I don't mind talking a little bit more about Ecclesiastes since y'all haven't really dived into that one, and it's a weird one. So the whole book of Ecclesiastes, let me see if I can pull it up here. It might be here. I think, yeah, it is. Okay, so can you guys see this text? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so the words of the preacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Somebody want to guess who that is? Yeah,
Solomon.
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 Gotcha. So vanity of vanities, says the preacher. We're going to talk about this word. It's said like 30 times. It's said 5 times right here in this one verse. Says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all his toil at which he toils under the sun? Okay. So the frame of the book, the whole introduction of the book Ecclesiastes, is we are just looking at the world under the sun. So he's speaking of the world poetically as if the world were simply under the sun. So not including God. Does that make sense? Because God's above the sun. So it's like, hey, just under the sun,
Okay.
if we're just looking at like the sun down, this is how we would see the world. And he has quite the philosophical wrestling match with like, where is God? Why can't we see God? Do we really know what happens to us after we die? How can we know that? And then he's speaking of God, but there's only hints of God that we can see under the sun, and we can't know him. And it's this crazy philosophical wrestling match with living life under the sun. Oh, basically, only what we can see, only what we can perceive, right? So, fascinating book, Ecclesiastes. We'll talk more about that. I don't mind going a little deeper since you guys haven't gotten into that one as much. Okay, but the goal of all wisdom literature is that it trains God's people to live well in a broken world, right? Um, Proverbs seems to be the more optimistic of the book. Okay. Ecclesiastes is the pessimist, right? He is having a rough day and being really honest about that. And Job is also going through a very hard time and asking really gutsy, honest questions about the justice of God. He's really wrestling with if you say you're sovereign, you're powerful over everything, and you say you're omniscient, you know everything, so you're all powerful, you're all knowing, and you're good, then why are my children dead? Explain it. I mean, he's going straight at God's face with that question. Like the philosophical problem of evil. If you're really all knowing and you're really all good and you're really all powerful, why in the world are my children dead right now? Like why am I a righteous person and I'm suffering? That makes no sense. So it's such a good book. It's very, very raw. Okay. So here's a unifying theme of all the wisdom literature. The unifying theme is the fear of the Lord, right? All of these are going to come back to the fear of the Lord. Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Makes sense. Proverbs is largely about learning to be a wise person. Job, behold the fear of the Lord. That's wisdom. Okay, just in case you wanted to know what wisdom is, it's the fear of the Lord. Thanks, Job. Here's an imperative, a command: fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole summary of Ecclesiastes. That's kind of the final logical conclusion of the whole book of Ecclesiastes is after he wrestles with all the crazy stuff in a chaotic world and what we can see and what we can't and the confusion and the hurt and the pain. It just all comes down here to, you know what, guys? There's some stuff we're not going to know, and we need to fear God and we need to obey God. Like that we can know, and that we do need to do. And sometimes we need to be okay with that. So that's really where Ecclesiastes lies. But as you can see, in all three of these, fear the Lord, fear the Lord, fear the Lord, right? That's a massive massive theme in all of wisdom literature. Okay, so let's look at these a little bit more closely individual. Proverbs, these are general patterns for how life usually works. Okay, so usually, if you work really hard and you save, you'll be rich, right? So he's like, hey, son, being poor doesn't sound fun, does it? No. So it'd be better to have money than not, and then we can be generous and care for people. And so, how about you work hard and save? Right? That's what he says. Um, Generally speaking, if you're a good friend, you'll get good friends. Generally speaking, if you hang out with idiots, you're going to be an idiot, right? So, generally speaking, this is how this kind of stuff works. It's also mostly it's a man speaking to his son for the most part, except for the last chapter, it's a mother speaking to her son. But so he talks a lot about stuff young men would struggle with, like, hey, you know how that prostitute said it's okay because her husband's out of town? Guess what? Every time that she says her husband's out of town, I bet that's not true. I bet she's just trying to, and then her husband's going to come back home, and then you're going to get on the news. So, how about not do that, right? So, that's the kind of stuff we learn in Proverbs. So, short, memorable sayings based on observation. Now, it's important to note that these are principles, they're not promises, right? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. That's not like a medical protocol, right? It's just, this is common sense stuff. And that's very important because Ecclesiastes is going to kind of push back against the Proverbs, and we're going to find a balance of wisdom, not just in the Proverbs, but in how all three of these intersect. So that's very, very important. Job is a righteous man who suffers without any explanation as far as he is concerned. Now, look, Proverbs tells you how life generally works. Well, generally speaking, if you're righteous and charitable and you're generous and you're kind, well, you're probably not gonna, end up in prison with all your friends who stabbed you in the back, right? Like that would be rare. But in Job, that's basically exactly like we have this dude and he loses everything and all of his friends are nothing but burdens to him and he is righteous. So Job is kind of poking at, hey, what about the day when the Proverbs aren't true, right? What about the day when I was righteous and I was generous and I was hardworking and I lost all my money and my family and my friends are no good and I did do the right thing and I didn't see the reward? Like what about the guy who plants and he plants and he plants and he doesn't harvest? Like what do we do there? What's the explanation there? That's what Job is asking. So do you see how Job is kind of pushing back against the Proverbs, right? Most of Job is dialogues. They're poetic dialogues. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my opinion on Job. If you study it on your own and you find yourself thinking another way to interpret Job, that's totally cool. Just have a good biblical reason for it. My conclusion is that all throughout the book, Job is righteous. You're like, yeah, but he fussed at God. I'm like, well, at the end of the narrative, God says that Job is a good dude, and then tells Job to make a sacrifice on behalf of his moron friends so that they can be forgiven and live and not die. So Job is like, he's clearly the hero of the show. So God apparently cares way less about you wrestling with him and questioning him than he does about you kicking somebody when they're down and misinterpreting his character, right? Because the fact is, Job questioning God came from a place of faith. Like the problem is, I do believe that you're sovereign. The problem is, I do believe that you're good. That's why I'm so confused. Like the confusion, even the anger came from a place that did believe that God was who he said he was. Where the friends were basically telling Job he must have done something wrong because surely God would never let anything this bad happen to a good guy. So they're telling this righteous man that he's not righteous and heaping burdens on a man when really they should have been comforting him. and God's not a fan of Job's friends. So I think Job's a righteous dude. I think his friends are idiots, except for his one friend at the very end, Elihu. He's a younger guy. He's quiet the whole narrative, and then he's finally like, "Okay, I'm literally about to like burst into flames. I cannot hold this in anymore. I try to be quiet because I'm young and I wanted to respect you guys, but you guys were saying dumb stuff, so now I'm gonna step up." And he does kind of give Job a slap on the wrist, like, hey, you should be defending God instead of, but the fact is, like, he speaks truth. I think he's a voice of wisdom at the end. The reason I think that is at the very end, God asked Job to make a sacrifice on behalf of all of his friends, except Elihu. He doesn't need to make a sacrifice for Elihu. So I think, and plus just what he says seems wise. So that's my read on Job. Now, we go to Ecclesiastes. This is the crazy one, right? Life under the sun is frustrating. It's fleeting. It's confusing. A big theme is like life is so short and it seems so meaningless most of the time. That's a massive theme in Ecclesiastes. Like everything we do, just we go to work, then we go to sleep, then we go to work, then we go to sleep, then we go to work, then we go to sleep, and then we die. Like this is, it seems so, if all we have is what we can see under the sun, that is completely useless, right? And he wrestles with that. He also wrestles with the truth that wisdom is limited. Like even everyone on their best day, like they only have so much wisdom. Oh, Ryan, you took our advice and you interrupted me. Good for you. Let's look at what you said. Oh yeah, partial truths. Thanks. I did skip that. You're correct. Let's go back up here. Yes. Thank you. Appreciate it. Sorry, guys. Going back to Job, the dialogues, like his friends who are bashing him the whole time, they say a lot of true things right before they say the false things, right? So they say things like, well, God is a just God. And you're like, absolutely. And then they're like, so he would never allow the righteous to suffer. And you're like, nope, 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 nope. That's not how that works. And they say things like, well, wealth is given to the hardworking and honest man. And you're like, yeah, it's generally true. It sounds like a proverb, as a matter of fact. And they're like, well, you had everything taken, so you must have not been an honest man. You must have been an evil man toward the orphan and the widow. There's one point where they actually accuse him of harming orphans and widows. And so what they do, and it's kind of, I think the author is doing this on purpose. They're saying like proverb truths, but then they're holding them so rigidly that there's no exceptions for the times when the world is just fallen and things are just broken and the world isn't redeemed yet. So they say a lot of things that sound true, but then they carry them so staunchly. They basically have no room for suffering in the world. Um, People that do this kind of thing, I was actually just listening to a prosperity preacher today who basically said, like, hey man, like if you name it, if you speak that you are gonna be healthy, like you will create that world basically. And it's like, first of all, that's not how faith works. Faith actually doesn't create anything. God creates things. Faith in him just triggers it. Like our words actually don't have any power. God has power. So that in itself is heresy. But the fact is, like, they're leaning into this idea that if you're a good person and if you have faith and if you're really believing in God, then basically nothing can ever go wrong in your life. And it's like, bro, you sound a lot more like Job's friends than Jesus. You better be careful. Like those partial truths are really dangerous. So yes. So the what God is doing there is he's correcting simplistic thinking. He's correcting simplistic thinking, especially about suffering. Especially about suffering. Cool. Thanks for that, Ron. All right, back to Ecclesiastes. So a big thing that this author is wrestling with is the fact that wisdom is limited. So he talks a lot about how wise he is. He's like, dude, I'm like super educated. I actually, we know Solomon actually prayed for wisdom and God gave it. Like, he's a very wise person. And several times in the book, he's like, look, I'm super wise. And can I tell you something? Doesn't do much good. What is all the wisdom in the world going to do whenever you still have evil in the world? What, help you know more about it? Matter of fact, sometimes he's like, sometimes having wisdom just makes you more sad. Now, he's not saying don't pursue wisdom. Wisdom is good, but wisdom is limited. And he just kind of laments and embraces the fact that wisdom only gets you so far. It can't fix every problem. So I remember when I was younger, like these, people from the city would come into our school and they'd tell us, brush your teeth and whatever, and, doing drugs is bad. And I remember thinking, like, e- everybody knows doing drugs is bad. Nobody's doing drugs because they think it's good. They're doing drugs because they have no hope. Like, you guys think you're going to educate, like, drug culture? Like, we're not stupid, we're sinful. Okay? Like, nobody lacks wisdom and thought cocaine was a good idea. That's not what happened. Like there's a limit that wisdom has. Okay, there's a lack of hope. Hope is more valuable at some point. So there's a wisdom has a limit. God's sovereignty is real. That is a huge theme in Ecclesiastes, is that God is sovereign. So you might have a lot of questions, you might have a lot of confusion, you might have a lot of pain. Here's one thing you don't need to question, whether or not God's completely and utterly in control of all of it. So at least we don't need to have that debate. Guys, it's so fascinating. Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, a lot, they're working together to give us kind of a theology of suffering in the world. Nowhere in any of these books do they ever propose, like, maybe God's not sovereign. It's just not a question. Job's like, no, God's totally sovereign. That's why I'm mad at him. Like, but the question, if God's sovereign, is not the issue. It's why is God using his sovereignty to make my life miserable? Like that's the question. But it's like never on the table that maybe God's not in charge. Like that, it just doesn't come up. It's so clear to these guys that God is sovereign. The issue isn't is God sovereign? It's why is he allowing evil in the midst of his sovereignty? And then this is an interesting turn that we find in all over Ecclesiastes, and it's not as much of an emphasis in many other books. Maybe in the Proverbs it is, but in Ecclesiastes he says over and over and over, like, hey, enjoy God's gifts. Over and over, and he's like, man, the world's hard, the world's confusing, the world is so wearisome, I'm so tired. And then he's like, you know what? Like, you should really just like have a good meal, get some good bread. Like, have you ever had really good bread? Like for real good bread? Like he says this throughout the whole book. Like, just get a glass of wine. Have a meal with some friends. He says, put oil in your hair. Man, dress up. Go out. Look good. Buy something nice. Like he's not saying money can buy happiness, but he's saying it can sure make you feel better. And that's not always a bad thing to do in a broken world. And you don't hear that a lot in the church. It's like, well, our hope should be in Jesus. He's like, dude, our hope is in God, but like, I want a good meal. Like, we don't have to choose. He's like, there are practical ways that we can enjoy God's gifts that make us feel better in a hard world. He's like totally okay with that. Great. We got another question. Thank you for interrupting me. You guys are great. Okay, if all three of these books are interacting with each other, do they all have the same earthly author? No, they do not have the same earthly author. So, Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon, Proverbs are written by Solomon. Job was written far before. Job is technically the oldest book in the Bible. I don't know if you guys know that. Job was before Genesis. So like Moses would have been able to read Job. So when I say that they're interacting, I'm saying it seems because they have similar themes and similar imagery and similar, yeah, mostly the theme. It's they are utilized to interact with one another, and they all seem to be wrestling with what it means to fear God and be a wise person and a God-fearing person in a world with suffering. So that they work together to produce a wise person. Excellent question, Ryan. Thanks. All right, any other questions before we move on? All right, let's keep trucking. Okay, so how to read wisdom literature. This is important. Wisdom literature forces us to slow down, reflect, and feel the tension of living in a fallen world. Okay, so like when you're reading through Romans and you're like, oh, argument. Okay, oh, that's okay, that's a contrast. And then he's building an argument. And then okay, he pivots and then he asks this rhetorical question. And it's like super brainy and you're trying to like follow his argumentation. Okay, Proverbs, not what's happening there. Proverbs is like a piece of gum. Like you take this one little proverb and then you just chew on it for like a half an hour. And you just kind of try to suck all the juice out of one like Proverbs are not meant to be read like Romans or or even like narratives you're supposed to keep the pace and follow the movement. Proverbs are just like take this piece of gum and chew on it for a while, come back and tell me what you think about it. Like Proverbs are they're very meditative. All scripture is meditative in the sense that we're supposed to think about it. These are intentionally designed, the poetry is intentionally designed to force you to slow down and to try to deal with the words and their connections and their implications. And that's why a lot of times, almost like how in our culture, like how a riddle works. Sometimes, like if someone knock knock, who's there? Like this is a funny joke. It's, we haha and then we keep moving on. But a riddle, you're supposed to like stop and scratch your head and like, wait a second. Okay, let me think about that. Like the nature of a riddle forces you to slow down and to wrestle with it and to try to get the nuance, right? That's what wisdom literature is forcing you to slow down and to think about it and to try to get the nuance, right? All right, let's keep trekking here. All right, let's talk a little bit about the context and the structure of these dudes. So, Proverbs, first 9 chapter is a father speaking to a son. A lot of that is just how to not be a dummy. It's stuff that your grandma would have told you if you had a good grandma. She would have told you stuff like that. Don't hang out with kids who are smoking stuff. Like that's probably if you get invited somewhere at 1 a.m., that like it's probably not a good idea to go. Why don't you go places when you're invited at 1 p.m.? Like better things happen at 1 p.m. Like um chapters 10 through 29. These are all the collections of the sayings. These are the really short little like figures of speech. And then at the very end, okay, I call him Agor. I don't know how to say it. But that's this sage dude, and he's speaking. And then Proverbs 31, which is like the poem about the ideal chick, right? That's Lemuel, right? And that is a king who has a cool mom. And technically, this is like his mom being like, hey, my son, this is how you find a chick who's really awesome. And then she describes a really awesome chick. Um, by the way, in Proverbs 31, she describes the ideal woman as like having really like burly arms, which I just think is hilarious and unexpected. And for some reason, no one ever preaches that verse. But she's like, the homegirl's been working out. So I just think that that's funny. Like, but she does stuff. Basically, the image is like she's like, complimenting her husband. She's taking care of her kids, and she's also buying and selling land. Like she's in real estate. Like she's overseeing servant. Like she's doing stuff. She's busy. Like she's very competent, capable, multi-talented woman. Um, okay. So some of this is repetitive. I want to make sure we have plenty of time at the end. Let's move forward. Job. Okay, so the chapters 1 and 2 are the narrative prologue. Okay, the Job, the most important. Like honestly, if I had to teach Job in 4 sermons, like if I only had 4 weeks, I would literally do 1 and 2, and then the next week I would do 3 through 37. Like, because 1 and 2 is so important to set the stage. And the big, big thing that the author really wants you to see is this is God being sovereign. Like Satan is very involved, but he's a dog on a leash, and God's holding the leash. Like God is the one who is very much over this. Then we have the dialogues and debates, and his friends, who all sound like hobbits, are being losers, and that's no fun. And then Elihu speaks last. Once again, I think Elihu is cool. Some people disagree with me. I've already given you my evidence for that. You can feel free to disagree. And then we have 38 through 41, which is God showing up and saying, I'm God. I don't think you really understand everything that I'm overseeing right now. He talks a lot about ostriches. It's a pretty cool little speech. And then chapter 42, everybody is restored. Job sacrifices on behalf of his friends, and there's restoration. And then he gets like double of everything. So that's pretty cool. So key points. Um, yeah, this is well said. John Piper said this. The friends give correct theology in the wrong situation. So they say things like, God's being just. And it's like, you know what? God always is just. This in particular does not seem to be a direct act of justice. This seems to be something else. So like you have good theology. You're applying it to Job in a way that doesn't fit him right now. Right? Um Elihu's the only friend God does not rebuke. That's why I think he's cool. And then Job teaches us wisdom is limited again. And remember, we saw that in Ecclesiastes, but it's also a theme in Job. That's why we put them together. This is a massive theme in Job. We can't reduce suffering to formulas. That's real. That's maybe the main point. Is Job's friends try to reduce an explanation of his suffering to a formula, and it doesn't work like that. There's always mystery and suffering. God runs the world with infinite wisdom. That's the point of God's speech at the very end. Like, I have infinite wisdom. So if you don't understand something, it's because you don't understand. It's not because I'm messing up. So you need to trust that. Um, and then also, God gets really upset with people saying stupid things to suffering people. Guys, this is a big deal. It's very, very, very important. If somebody's suffering, like, we need to be incredibly cautious before we start moving to try to blame the person who is suffering. Now, I'm not saying that's not the case sometime, right? Some like the Proverbs are also true, right? Now we need a way because the proverb says, "Hey, look, a lot of times you suffer, it's because you did something dumb." Right? And that's true. We don't want to downplay the Proverbs, but we also don't want to downplay Job's, which says sometimes when you're suffering, it's not because you did anything dumb. So before we jump to just, oh, well, if this guy's poor, it must be because he's lazy. Well, no. Maybe it's because his wife got cancer and they're covered up in medical bills, even though he's working 3 jobs. And you don't know what you're talking about, and you need to shut your mouth and figure out the situation and have some wisdom. And on the other side, oh, this guy's really wealthy. He must be super hardworking. Yeah, or maybe he owns Playboy and he made a lot of money off of some horrible things. And so basically there's exceptions to the proverbs, and we need to use wisdom and discernment before just assuming things are how they appear. Ecclesiastes. Okay, chapters 1 and 2, experiments in meaning. Okay, actually, how about how about we just go look at Ecclesiastes because we're almost done. Let's just go look at Ecclesiastes for a second. How about that? Okay, so this is how Ecclesiastes starts, okay? The word of the preacher, okay, that's Kohelet in Hebrew. For those of you who want to say preacher in Hebrew, it's Kohelet. All right, you're welcome. All right, so the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem, Solomon, okay? So some scholars, I actually used to hold this and then I learned more about Hebrew, but some scholars actually think that this is a anachronistic retelling of something from Solomon. So, for example, have any of you guys seen Alexander Hamilton? Is that what it's called? It's called Alexander, or what's it called? Sorry. Rachel, you know.
It's just Hamilton.
Great. Hamilton. It's called Hamilton. Okay. So it's a play that came out, in the modern era, and he's pretending to be Alexander Hamilton, right? Now we all know that's not actually Alexander Hamilton. Like nobody in their right mind sitting in the audience is like, wait, is this the real guy? Like, of course it's not. But he's pretending to be that guy in a way that is honest but is artistic, and he's saying things that he would have said, So some people think actually this isn't Solomon, it's someone speaking as if they were Solomon in an artistic way. There's Hebrew variants and timelines and all that stuff going to that, but I think it's actually Solomon now. I think it's actually Solomon. And he says this, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Okay, he says this word over, yeah, at least 29 times in the book. Okay, vanity, this word is hevel. Um, Depending on how you want to pronounce Hebrew, it's Hebel or Hevel. Hevel is probably the more common pronunciation, Hevel. But it means breath, air, breath, or vapor, like a vapor. So that's the actual word. It means vapor. So like you could, like if somebody gets hit in the stomach, the Hevel would come from their mouth. Like that, it's a literal word that means air or breath. And he says breath, breath, says the preacher, just vapor, vapor. Everything's a vapor, right? So he starts off with this imagery of it's just life is gone. It's fast and it's enigmatic, right? We can't get a hold of it. We can't really understand it. And like we're seeing it, but we're also not really able to see it, right? We can't really grasp a hold of it. We can't really understand it. And it's there, but it's fleeting. It's fast, right? So vanity of vanities, Hevel. Hevel is the imagery there. And then he goes on throughout the whole book. And this is basically the whole book. Like all things are full of weariness. We can't even like utter it. It's hard to say like how crazy and dissatisfying everything is. So, we see stuff, but we never really see enough, and we hear stuff, but we never hear enough. Like it's just this dissatisfied confusion that he has with all of life. So that is the words of the preacher. Now, notice this. This is important. There's an author, right? The author says, hey guys, I'm the author. These are the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. So, an author is writing about a sermon that he hears from Solomon. So, the preacher, Kohelet, the preacher is Solomon. The author is maybe a wise person that heard his preaching, right? It could also be Solomon. He could be writing in third person about himself. But it's important to notice that there's an author and then there's a preacher. And let me show you why that is, because I hope I remember this right. Yeah. Because at the very, very end, so see all this, did you guys know, like whenever it's indented like that, that means it's Hebrew poetry? Did y'all know that? Okay. Yeah, if the text is indented like this on the screen, it means it's poetry. So eventually the sermon ends, right? The sermon ends. And then we have the author kind of steps back on stage. And then he says, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. So the author kind of takes the pen back at the very end and talks about the preacher again. And then he says the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Like God's going to be just, fear him, obey him. Sometimes that's all the wisdom we have. That's how Ecclesiastes ends. So chapters 1 and 2, he's experimenting with meaning. Then the sermon moves into life's tensions. Like, man, sometimes this guy works so hard, but then he doesn't get any money. And then this guy's a lazy bum, but he inherits half of the world from his dad. And, you know, just sometimes life doesn't seem fair. And then sometimes it seems like we have such a good plan and it fails. And sometimes we have knowledge, but even the knowledge doesn't bring us all the wisdom that we wish it would. And then sometimes you have a good meal and then you eat so much you feel too full. And then the good meal doesn't even taste good. I mean, the whole thing, he's just wrestling with the complexities of life and really what's dissatisfying about life. Then he has Proverbs, reflections, and warnings. And then the final conclusion. That's what we just read.